We can help the property owners at any stage of the life cycle. And so then if we're brought in early enough in the acquisition process, there's many cases we can have the solution finished up prior to closing. And so then we've had cases where the investor's been able to go back to their lender, renegotiate the loan proceeds. A recent case, we shaved about 30,000 off of, the anticipated flood expense. So that made quite a substantial difference in their loan proceeds at closing. And then they walk into the deal day one, with some, added value.
Welcome to the How to Scale Commercial Real Estate Show. Whether you are an active or passive investor, we'll teach you how to scale your real estate investing business into something big.
DJ McClure is the Director of Business Development for National Flood Experts, a specialized engineering firm based in Tampa. He's an active investor as well as an LP in 1,100 units and currently works to help investors add value to their assets in flood zones. DJ, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Hey, man, the pleasure's mine. 3 questions I ask every guest who comes to the show. Can you tell us in 90 seconds or less where you started, where you are now, and how you got there?
Absolutely. Yeah. I grew up in a small town in Owensboro, Kentucky. Grew up playing tennis. So that allowed me to do a lot of international travel. Made Spanish my master's degree as a result of all my teammates from college. Loved sales. Tennis was kind of my education that led me to a couple different places around the world and then led me to the real estate world.
That's interesting. You wouldn't think tennis and Spanish would lead you into real estate, but yet, here we are. What is it that you do today?
So our engineering firm specializes kind of in the middle of a couple industries. And so we work with investors around the country to find cost-saving solutions for their properties in flood zones.
That's short and sweet. Talk to us then. For me, one of the early criteria on non-commercial properties was if it was in a flood zone, I just didn't buy it. Just said, man, that's too much hassle. Obviously, you get into commercial, there's bigger dollars. It might make sense still to buy it, but walk us through that process. Why does somebody elect to buy a project in a flood zone? And then, what do they do about it once they do?
Yeah. So, let's start where the root of the issue is, right? Any type of property that's located in a flood zone, and you're taking out some type of loan in the property, the lenders are federally required to mandate flood insurance at closing. And so then what happens is whatever limits the lender dictates, that's what you're required to buy. And for commercial, that can sometimes be some really high costs. The advantage here is that there's a lot of solutions that exist that aren't common knowledge. Be it you can have the flood zone changed in some instances so that mandate goes away. Or being the way flood insurance is currently structured, there's some solutions that exist, to go in from an engineering angle and make the policy premium less. So in both scenarios, that's some hidden NOI that you're adding to the deal, sometimes even before closing.
So, break down both of those. I'm familiar with the first process, but maybe you can explain both of those to us, just because I don't know whether this is 430 or 40 episodes by the time this goes live. I've not had anybody come on and talk about flood, being a flood expert. So tell me, the first process where you said you can get that zoning or get the flood map really changed. What does that mean?
Yeah, so you have properties falling in 3 categories of flood zones. So you have an X zone, which is the lower risk, not required by any lender for flood insurance. Then you have the A and the V categories. A being the most common around the country, V being your coastal, where there's some type of wave action that could happen to the property. And so what happens is that the flood maps are created at a local level. All the different counties around the country do their own flood studies independently. And then when the maps are put into place, in a lot of cases, it's done at a very macro level, based on history of the area that may dictate the level of detail they have the funding to be able to go to. And so what our team is doing is essentially identifying properties that have engineering characteristics to show that those buildings can be changed from an A flood zone to an X. And then FEMA will issue a special amendment that all the lenders will then recognize. And so for some cases, then you can cancel the flood insurance. You could convert it to a lesser priced premium. It really gives some options to the investor.
Yeah, and so and that is a building characteristic, or is that the fact that the buildings lay, maybe it was the survey wasn't quite correct, or I mean, how does that happen? How does that work?
Yeah, so the flood maps just don't take into account building by building levels of detail. They have to look at things on more of a city block, type level. And so what we're doing is essentially coming into FEMA and providing an extra layer of information, building specific, that those buildings have details that we can essentially get them excluded from the current flood map.
Got it. So that's one way of going about it. You said there was two things you could do there. What was the other one?
Yeah. So the way flood insurance through FEMA is currently structured, there's a lot of different engineering data points that go into the premium. It's like one big math equation, if you want to think about it simply. And so then when you go in at a really granular level and you start really dissecting all the details, anything in there that could be off in some cases by even a small margin, that results in dollar savings at the end of the day. So something in some cases as much as 1/10 of a foot can be several $1,000s in savings per building. So what our team is doing is we're essentially auditing all the details, really getting to a really granular level to find any number of scenarios that may qualify to help make a reduction in premium when that first option is not available.
Yeah, man, that's absolutely fascinating. What point in the due diligence or pre-buy phase does someone approach you?
So typically once someone has put an LOI in place, they're into due diligence where they're able to get access to, perhaps the seller's flood insurance information, elevation documents that the seller may have on the buildings. That's typically when we get brought in to do our first initial review. There's no cost to the investor for us to qualify if there's an opportunity on that particular property. And then it's all engineering based. So we can either help or we can't. It's quite definitive at that point. And so then once we have a solution, at that point, they may include that in their underwriting and how they're looking at approaching, the final stage of the deal.
Yeah, and I think the interesting point that you brought up there was that if you can shave off, that expense of flood insurance or something else, you're not just saving that on NOI basis, but then the property becomes, that much more valuable because it's no longer in a flood zone or is, labeled differently maybe than what it was before. So you get enormous upside there, with that change in status. So I think that's really, really intriguing. We've talked a little bit about what you guys do. I guess let me ask one last question. So if you guys come up with a solution, then, do they wait till after they close that you guys then come and put that solution in place?
Honestly, we can help the property owners at any stage of the life cycle. And so then if we're brought in early enough in the acquisition process, there's many cases we can have the solution finished up prior to closing. And so then we've had cases where the investor's been able to go back to their lender, renegotiate the loan proceeds. A recent case, we shaved about 30,000 off of, the anticipated flood expense. So that made quite a substantial difference in their loan proceeds at closing. Yeah. And then they walk into the deal day one, with some, added value.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. That's absolutely intriguing. Is that something that you as a buyer want to keep under wraps? You don't want to let your seller know necessarily that there's a reclassification possible.
I think most of the time the buyers keep this information in their pocket. Right. We've had some situations where they have gone back and renegotiated the price a bit, just based on some of the information. Right. But honestly, we try to stay out of that portion of the conversation. I don't want to ever interrupt a deal, hopefully only for the positive.
Right. Yeah, I would just be concerned if you had something that could really, juice the bottom line and then increase the value of the property, and you were putting in the hard work to get it done. That's something I would keep really close to the vest. So,
and we get brought in on both sides. So we'll meet. Let's say you and I met, and you had couple properties you were looking to offload this year, and we go through and do our analysis and find some solutions. We'll do that pre-listing. So this way, now the financials are a little bit adjusted, and it may help change the listing price that you put to the public.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's awesome. There are some changes coming in the flood world. I'll call it that. What are those?
Yeah, so FEMA insurance program, the National Flood Insurance Program, NFIP, as you may have heard it, they're actually changing their rating program, and it went into effect October 1st, for brand new policies. And it's starting to affect current policies that renew after April. And so what they've changed is essentially the rating equation that they're going to be using for pricing. And, we've already seen a lot of increases in certain parts of the country. So, there's a real opportune window that exists right now for investors that have properties in flood zones. And what we're doing is helping investors audit their entire portfolio to find any solutions that we can apply before they renew in this new system.
Okay. So when this rating or renewal of this new system goes into a place, what does that mean? It sounds like that's just going to be more expense to the people that have to buy flood insurance. Is that right?
Yeah. So some of the discounts and certain situations that have been beneficial to the property historically are going away, with this new program. And so essentially whatever an investor's premium price is when they roll into this new system, that's their new baseline. So let's just make an easy example. If someone has a property paying $20,000 a year, and if they come into this new program and hit the max increase, that could be as much as 18% for the next several years. So if we're able to go in and apply a solution, let's say we can get that 20,000 down to 5,000. Now, whatever increase they see, they're going to only increase on 5,000 versus 20.
Right. And that feels a lot better. But you have to get this done. This has to be in place before you say April 1st of this year.
Well, before they renew in 2022.
Okay.
So if they renew in June, as long as we get to them before June.
Got it. Okay. So or if they renew in November, you have to get to them before November. I got it.
Correct.
Okay. Great. Yeah. And that's absolutely intriguing. What are some other things that, as it pertains to flood insurance or the nuance of this industry, that the people should know to be thinking about when they're looking at buying or looking at selling?
Yeah. A real common scenario that we see is, someone will acquire a property, and part of their business plan will be maybe shifting from an initial type lending to agency debt, maybe year 3, year 4. Common strategy these days, especially with the cap rates, correct? So what will happen is the initial flood insurance mandates that you had in place and what Fannie and Freddie Mac require are not the same typically. And so what ends up happening is when you go to agency debt, they are going to want full limits for the buildings. They will require 12 months of rent income to also be insured on the flood policy. And so in many cases, someone may have been paying, just the NFIP max at $500,000 a building. And Fannie may say, well, we want $1.5 million a building. So naturally the costs can go up dramatically. And this doesn't oftentimes get learned until pretty close to the refi closing.
Right. Yikes. Yeah, that's a big ouch. How would someone underwrite that appropriately, when they're first buying the property?
That's a great question. I think it's tough to really underwrite, very closely because it depends on probably the type of loan that they end up going to at the refi. Right. In some cases, the limits stay the same. And in other cases, we've seen the premium costs, nearly double. The best thing they can do, honestly, is have, a group like us or someone really review the property to see if there are any solutions to have that changed before the refinance. So that way, hopefully the financials will be as strong as possible when you go into, leveraging, that new loan.
Right, man. That's those are lessons that unless you have learned those, or you talk to somebody like yourself, those are lessons you don't learn until you've had to learn it the hard way. And those can be very, very expensive lessons. That's fantastic. Thanks. Do you have any other thoughts on that, or things that we should be looking out for?
Yeah, there's one other really common scenario as well, that if you've never bought a property in a flood zone, you may not know to look for this. So what will happen, especially nowadays, as we've got some big market investors going in and buying some mom and pop properties, the seller may not have any debt on their property. They may not have had for several years. So when you're looking at the financials, you are not going to see a flood insurance line item listed. And the owner, in most cases, will tell you, "Oh, we're not in a flood zone," because no one's been requiring them to buy that flood insurance.
Right.
And so what happens is they go through the acquisition process, and then they usually get into those last couple of weeks. That's when they find out from the lender, "Hey, by the way, you need flood insurance." So it's always good to try to do a little research early on just to see if the property is in a flood zone. I have investors that email me all the time, and it takes a couple minutes. I can pull the property up and let them know pretty close to 100% what a lender will require.
Yeah.
And it's huge information to have from day one.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. That is intriguing. I wouldn't have thought about that. If they're not paying for flood insurance, they haven't thought about it. They haven't thought about the fact that, it's, and at this point, especially in today's market where, we're seeing offers that are going out with hard earnest money day one, where it's like, I guess maybe there's some ways out of that, but if you're a couple weeks from closing, it gets a lot more ugly. So that's certainly something. What else should we be thinking about?
I wouldn't necessarily shy away from a flood zone. There's some investors I talk to where, their strategy has always been, historically, they don't even look at properties that are in flood zones. And, I can tell you, one, being an investor myself, there's a deal I'm invested in that had some buildings in a flood zone that we worked on. We're adding about 17,000 to our own NOI, and so if you're the type of investor where you don't want that risk, that's totally understandable. But if you really like a deal and it happens to be in a flood zone, let's take a closer look, because we've helped in some cases add more than $1 million in value to properties around the country, and not just in markets that you would think like the Houstons and the Gulf Coast. I mean, we're talking all over the country. Most recently, 80,000 on a property in Hawaii. So this solution and type of scenario can be everywhere.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. 80,000 annually. Right. Yeah. And if you're buying on a 10 cap, that adds $800,000, or on a 5 cap, that's $1.6 million in increased value for the property. That's tremendous. So absolutely fantastic. DJ, thanks for taking the time today to really break down your industry, the flood expert side of the business. This has been a fun conversation. I've certainly enjoyed it and learned a lot from you. Let's jump here to the final 4 questions. The first one is this: what is one software that you find you can't live without?
that's a great one. Honestly, we live in Salesforce every day. Our whole company is, we live and breathe through our CRM.
Right, man. That's great. Yeah, absolutely. I don't know where we'd be without a good CRM today. Question number 2: if you could help our listeners avoid just one mistake in real estate, what would it be, and how would you avoid it?
I think asking more questions. Naturally, I'm going to lean to the flood side. But if something looks too good to be true, there's probably something under the surface that's worth asking a couple more questions.
Right, man. You can never ask too many questions. Speaking of, question number 3: when it comes to investing in the world, what's one thing you're doing right now to make the world a better place?
I like investing with people that have, programs in place to really spread, into the community. There's a group that I just invested with, and one thing that really drew me to the deal was they put a program in place last year, for helping to build some college scholarships for some of the kids in their communities, and some job training as well for some of the high school kids, just to kind of build some soft skills. It was one of the wives of one of the investors that was one of the general sponsors on the deal. And I thought that was a fantastic way to just redistribute the wealth. And it's great to see that, I can be a small part of that.
Right. That's cool, man. I love it. DJ, if our listeners want to get in touch with you or learn more about you, what is the best way to do that?
Yeah, they can send an email to myself, DJ at nationalfloodexperts.com. You can also, if you have a property that you'd like one of our team to take a look at, they can send an email to info@nationalfloodexperts.com. There's no cost or obligation for our team to do, our review on the property and then let you know if there's something that we may be able to do to help.
Fantastic. DJ, thank you for your time today.
Yes, sir. Thank you.